Welcome. My name is Mark Lozo. I'm the Education Director at the Theodore Roosevelt inaugural site. I see a lot of familiar faces, and I'd like to welcome you back. And for those who perhaps haven't been here before, I'd like to welcome you. This is going to be a very special edition of Speaker Night tonight, because we are welcoming back one of our own, Lenora Henson. Lenora Henson, much like Grover Cleveland or Millard Fillmore, is not a native of Buffalo, but an adopted product of Western New York. Lenora Henson grew up on Long Island in the lengthy shadow of Theodore Roosevelt's home at Sagamore Hill. Her interest in TR was piqued when her 8th grade social studies teacher assigned an article that was memorable not only for its title, When the Cows Were Drunk, but also for the story it told about blue milk and the creation of the FDA. After earning a bachelor's degree in history from SUNY Geneseo and a master's degree with a concentration in the history of Progressive Era America from the University of New Hampshire, Lenora joined the staff of Buffalo's Theodore Roosevelt inaugural National Historic Site as curator in 1999. She continued to serve in that capacity for 23 years, assuming the duties of Director of Public Programming and Deputy Director along the way, in addition to caring for the collection and shaping the TR site's public programming initiative with offerings such as a Transcribe-a-thon in collaboration with the Library of Congress, April Fool's Fun, adult field trips, speaker night, and trivia night. Lenora also appeared on the Travel Channel's Mysteries at the Museum and consulted on a project to create a Theodore Roosevelt Rough Rider bobblehead, something she is extraordinarily proud of, and may regard as a grandest accomplishment. Beyond the TR site, Lenora served on the board of the Museum Association of New York as a panelist for the New York State Council on the Arts Museum Program, as the Region 2 Chair for the American Association for State and Local History's National Leadership and History Awards Program, and as an adjunct professor at Damon University. In addition to contributing chapters to 2 recent books, Lenora's work has been published in several peer-reviewed journals and Western New York History magazine. Currently, she's collaborating on a new TR-related project and looking forward to seeing where the research leads her. Tonight, she has a very exciting topic, a topic which, for those of you who have doceted here, you may understand and appreciate a little bit more, because we often get the question here, who the heck was Ansley Wilcox? And why was Theodore Roosevelt staying in his home? So it actually is a very relevant question for us, and a natural question for people to ask. But Lenora has a program that can answer that for us. So Lenora, take it away.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be back. Honestly, it's humbling to see so many people here, so many familiar faces, and gratifying at the same time. And I'm delighted to be able to put on my historian hat once more and share some of my research with all of you. Before I go any further, though, I want to acknowledge that this evening's talk is based on work I first presented during the 103rd annual meeting of the Theodore Roosevelt Association, which was hosted by the inaugural site here in Buffalo last October, and later published in the winter-spring 2023 edition of the Theodore Roosevelt Association Journal. So, if you attended that conference or are an avid reader of the journal, please do me a favor and don't spoil the story for everyone else. All right. So for the conference, I was tasked with exploring the relationship between Theodore Roosevelt and Ansley Wilcox. to be perfectly honest, as Mark kind of alluded to, if we'd run into each other 25 years ago and you'd asked me who Ansley Wilcox was, I would have had absolutely no idea that he was the guy who hosted TR's hasty and unexpected 1901 inauguration in the library of his home. This home, in fact. Luckily, I moved to Buffalo and quickly learned quite a bit about Mr. Wilcox and TR's unusual inauguration. When I consider these two men, I'm always struck by some of the parallels between their life experiences, particularly in their early years. Both were born in antebellum America. Ansley Wilcox on January 27, 1856, and Theodore Roosevelt more than 2 years later on October 27, 1858. Which means that Ansley was 5 years old, and T.D., as his family called him, was about 2.5 when the first shots of the Civil War fired at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Ansley and T.D. both came from well-to-do families. Their fathers and grandfathers, who were all businessmen, had deep northern roots, while their mothers were each from southern families who profited from enslaved labor. Both men were educated at Ivy League universities. Ansley was 18 years old when he graduated from Yale in 1874. TR graduated from Harvard 6 years later in 1880. Both men also married young. Ansley married Buffalo's own Cornelia Coburn Rumsey on January 17, 1878, just days before his 22nd birthday. Meanwhile, Theodore married Alice Hathaway Lee on his 22nd birthday, October 27, 1880. For a bit of context, it's worth noting that in 1880, the average age at marriage for white men in the United States was 27.1 years old. So Ansley and TR were ahead of that particular curve. Tragically, both men also lost their beloved wives in similar circumstances about 3 years into their respective marriages. Cornelia Wilcox gave birth to a daughter on November 4th, 1880, and died not quite 7 weeks later, December 22nd. Roosevelt's darling Alice gave birth to their daughter on February 12th, 1884, and succumbed to kidney disease 2 days later. Unfortunately, this situation was not uncommon at the time. In the 19th century, about 500 to 1,000 mothers died for every 100,000 live births. Again, by way of comparison, most rich countries today have a maternal mortality ratio below 10 deaths per 100,000 births. Last on the little list of commonalities that always come to mind when I think of Ansley Wilcox and Theodore Roosevelt is their shared interest in social and political reform. Ultimately, it was through their work in this area that the men became acquainted, and even their final correspondence would reflect this long-standing connection. These commonalities, however interesting, tell only part of the Ansley Wilcox-Theodore Roosevelt story. Of the two men, I'm going to make a guess that Ansley is the lesser-known quantity. Am I right? Oh, good. Certainly, the shop downstairs has a veritable stack of books that will illuminate seemingly every aspect of TR's life, whereas I suspect, unless things have changed, Mark, there isn't even a slim volume down there devoted to Ansley. With that in mind, I think it might help if I spend a few more minutes reviewing Ansley's life story before exploring his relationship with Roosevelt in more depth. As mentioned earlier, Ansley was born on January 27, 1856. Although the Wilcox family had been in Connecticut for generations and had been involved in founding both Hartford and New Haven, Ansley was born in Somerville, Georgia, near Augusta. After graduating from college in the 1840s, Ansley's father, Daniel Hand Wilcox, had followed an older brother south. In both the 1850 and 1860 federal census, Daniel Hand Wilcox is listed as a merchant living in Augusta, Georgia. In the 1860 census, 1 year before the Civil War broke out, his estate, which included a combination of both real and personal property, was valued at $200,000, or approximately $7.4 million today. At least some of that fortune had been made in the lucrative guano industry. And can I just tell you that it took all I could not to go into like a detour into the guano industry, but I pulled myself in. Anyway, as this attestation from a satisfied customer shows, Ansley's father had teamed up with a Mr. Gibbs to import Phoenix guano that, when applied by John C. Whitner down here to his turnip patch, far exceeded his expectations. I'll just, read this in case I know this might be hard. Mr. Daniel H. Wilcox and Company, Augusta, Georgia, it affords me pleasure to state that the Phoenix guano sent by your Mr. Gibbs was applied by me on a turnip patch, and the result has far exceeded my expectations. This guy was really into it. I divided the patch into squares upon which I varied the application. Upon some, guano alone, others guano, salt, and ashes, and others guano, salt, and lime, putting at the rate of 300 pounds guano to the acre, 2 bushels of salt, and 1 bushel of lime and ashes. It was all carefully done under my personal supervision and up to date. I cannot discover any differences in the different plats, but the whole is one of the finest patches of turnips I ever saw. The soil is a light sandy surface with clay subsoil and not naturally strong. I am greatly pleased with the guano. I love this. There are more of them, but I thought this was the best one. Anyway, although he lived in the South and grew his business in the context of enslaved labor, Daniel Hand Wilcox was described by his wife, the former Frances Louisa Ansley, as, quote, very positively opposed to the Southern view of things and willing to express his mind freely. According to Ansley's mother's self-published memoirs, the family spent several years of living in terror after the Civil War broke out, and her husband slept, quote, with a gun at the head of his bed. Eventually, Ansley's father secured a commission from the Confederacy that provided him with passage to England. He was tasked with trading some of the South's abundant cotton for much-needed cash. Young Ansley stayed behind with his mother and 4 siblings until the fall of 1864, when the family began a rather harrowing journey to reunite with its patriarch on the same day. The journey began on the same day that General Sherman began his march through Georgia. So the Mrs. Wilcox, Daniel, Frances Louisa Ansley Wilcox's memoirs talk about the journey, and so I, created this kind of Google map showing how they escaped the South. It was quite the journey. She talks about, they were, it was a little bit of the 19th century version of planes, trains, and automobiles, all sorts of different modes of transportation, and she had, I think, 4 or 5 kids, under the age of whatever, tagging along. She tells one story about, there was one kid who they were taking a wagon through some creek or whatever, and she turned around and oops, I forget which kid it was no longer in the wagon, so they had to go back and make sure that, and pick him up again. There was, of course, illness. It was all the things you might expect in this kind of journey. So they, ended up going through Canada and then eventually ending up back in Connecticut. Let's see, where did I leave? Let's see. The only reference, and I find this very interesting, the only reference I'm aware of that had Ansley making reference to the trip appears in his personal copy of his mother's memoirs. And this is a page here. And as you can see, he writes in the margins, mother was then 34 years old, I was 8 years old, And I remember much of this journey, Ansley Wilcox. It's the only thing I've ever seen him referring to it. I'd love to know what he remembers, but, remembered, but I don't know. That was it. Ultimately, the family was, however, reunited and settled in New Haven, where 5 more children were added to its ranks. Ansley's education began in earnest. Ansley was approximately 14 years old when he graduated from Hopkins Grammar School in 1870. 4 years later, his name appeared in a New York Times account of a regatta held in Saratoga, New York. Rowing for Yale, Ansley, quote, went to the front on 34 strokes per minute and defeated his closest competitor in the single scull race by 2 lengths. I did a little Googling last night, and apparently 34 strokes per minute is not bad. So, because I really didn't know. Had to look that up. But Ansley graduated from Yale that same year, 1874, and continued his studies in England at Oxford University. Somewhere along the way, Ansley made the acquaintance of Buffalo businessman Dexter Phelps Rumsey and his daughters, Cornelia and Mary Grace. Let's see. Oh, good. That's them. It's not clear exactly when, where, and how Ansley met the Rumsey family. However, he may have gotten to know Buffalonian George P. Sawyer when they were students together at Yale. Ansley's older sister, Ida, married Sawyer in 1874 and subsequently moved to the Queen City. The Sawyers and Rumseys were both prominent families and moved in similar circles. So, it stands to reason that that may be one of the, maybe how they connected. I'm not entirely sure. The earliest evidence we have of a Wilcox-Rumsey connection is a diary that Cornelia kept while she was on a family trip to Europe at the age of 23. It was 1876. On January 5th, she writes in her diary, quote, "Father discovered Mr. Wilcox, who had just arrived from Calais, having heard we were in Paris." So, again, it's this kind of one-off sentence in her journal. It sounds like there was, to me, it sounds like they already knew each other. And it also sounds like, Ansley Wilcox wandered in and off the street and Dexter found him, but that's all we have, that one sentence. By July, with some encouragement from Cornelia, Ansley had relocated to Buffalo. The following year, 1877, finds him listed in the Buffalo City Directory as a law student living at 26 Allen Street. By the end of March, his engagement to Cornelia Rumsey had been announced. They married, as I said earlier, on January 17, 1878, in what was described by the Buffalo Express as, quote, the most brilliant wedding of the season. In the weeks before his marriage, Ansley, along with his brother-in-law, George P. Sawyer, was among the community leaders who came together to form Buffalo's Charity Organization Society. The COS movement was an attempt to counter the social and economic problems of urbanization. It sought to establish a coordinated, community-wide response to urban poverty using a scientific approach to investigate, register, and supervise individuals and families who are applying for charity. And it's a movement that started in England. It's worth noting that Buffalo was the first U.S. city to establish a charity organization society. Ansley served as the nascent organization's secretary and was also the first person to chair its committee on mendicity. He became a trustee in 1881 and continued in that capacity for more than 45 years, serving as president for much of that time. The late 1870s and 1880s were an eventful time for Ansley. In addition to his charity work and community service, the newlywed was admitted to the bar and launched his legal career while continuing to mingle with Buffalo's elite. As I mentioned earlier, Cornelia gave birth to a daughter in November of 1880, and tragically the new mother died just before Christmas. Although Ansley didn't go west as TR did when he found himself in similar circumstances, he did rely on help from various relatives to care for his infant daughter.
Go ahead and say it.
You know me too well. Okay, so I can't help it. So the cool thing, well, there's nothing cool about his wife dying tragically 7 weeks after giving birth. But we've always known the daughter as named after her mother, Cornelia, nicknamed Nina. And then we got a family Bible was donated by a descendant. And, you know, it's this huge Bible. It's probably about that thick. It's a, you know, really good paperweight, which, you know, Bibles are, you know, they were the thing to really have at the, you know, 19th century. But these days, you know, the text isn't going to change that much and whatever. The valuable piece is the family record pages. And so I turned to the family record pages when we got this a few years ago and was kind of surprised because for the November 1880, when Cornelia gives birth to her daughter, it records her birth and her name as Mary Grace Wilcox. And I was like, huh, we always knew her as Nina. We thought her name was Cornelia, after her mother, not named after her aunt. And so that was kind of confusing. And then, you know, skip to the subsequent pages. And there was a note in the family record that on January 17th, 1881, which P.S. would have been Ansley and Cornelia's third wedding anniversary, they changed the baby's name to that of her mother. Yeah, we didn't know that. I thought that was cool. Yeah, so it's kind of this whole thing, and no one in the family had, you know, none of that information had kind of, you know, trickled down through the family. When I reached out to the donor, I was like, did you know this? And she was like, no. But again, kind of the cool things that you can find in documentary evidence. So, thanks, Leonard. I love that story. Can't help it. Anyway, letters suggest that Cornelia's younger sister, Mary Grace, who the kid was actually first named after, was among those who offered Ansley assistance in caring for the baby. Over time, the relationship between Ansley and Mary Grace evolved, and they were married in November 1883, which means that she was originally named for her aunt, who becomes her stepmother, and it's just, you know, very convoluted. But I enjoy that kind of stuff. The announcement of Ansley and Mary Grace's nuptials in the Buffalo Evening News makes me chuckle, and I can't help but wonder what Ansley thought of it. Is this not the best marriage announcement ever? Ansley Wilcox, the Adonis of the Buffalo Bar, will enter Hyman's bonds tomorrow, his fair partner being a daughter of Dexter P. Rumsey, Esquire. So now every time I think of Ansley, really in the back of my head, I'm hearing Ansley Wilcox, the Adonis of the Buffalo Bar. This is a picture from roughly about the time of the wedding. So, you know, apparently he was dashing. I'd love to know what he thought of that announcement. I feel like he must have known someone at the paper, because I know there was a whole thing, April Fool's, I forget what year it was, where they like published this thing that he had been appointed to some government appointment. So I almost feel like he probably knew someone at the paper and they were just yanking his chain. Hopefully he appreciated it. And if anyone, there are rumors that Ansley had no sense of humor. The man had a sense of humor. It was just very, very dry. That diary where we first heard about Dexter finding Mr. Wilcox in the lobby of the hotel, goes on, and he actually writes an entry in there. Cornelia gives him her diary to write an entry. It's hysterical. I mean, it's so dry humor, but he had a sense of humor, so don't let anybody tell you differently. All right, let's see, where was I? All right, in any event, the house here at 641 Delaware was actually a wedding gift to the couple from Mary Grace's father, Dexter. So whenever I'm talking about the house, I'm very careful to... Is Mary Grace mad at me? I'm airing the family laundry, she's mad at me. Anyway, I'm very careful to say Ansley Wilcox never owned the place. He lived here. It was his home, but it was a wedding gift from his father-in-law for their life residency. When they die in the 30s, the house actually goes back to his long-dead father-in-law's estate. Anyway, so almost 18 years after they get the house as a wedding gift, TR becomes the 26th president in the Holmes Library. So how exactly did that happen? It's a great question. And for a story I know pretty well, there are still missing pieces. As many of you probably know, there's no photo of TR raising his hand to take the oath of office in the Wilcox Library. That's a significant gap in the historical record. I don't know, maybe AI can do something about that. But anyway, I mentioned earlier we don't know exactly how the Wilcox-Rumsey connection came about, although I'd like to think that the answer to that question is still hiding in an archive somewhere, just waiting for some lucky person with enough time to do the research and suss out that detail. It's my hope that the question of how, when, and where Theodore Roosevelt and Ansley Wilcox first met falls into the same category, since, spoiler alert, we don't know. What do we know? The earliest letter I'm aware of between the two men is in the Theodore Roosevelt collection at the Library of Congress. Dated April 18, 1899, TR, then governor of New York, is clearly responding to a letter from Ansley. It is very hard to read, but he writes, My dear Mr. Wilcox, I have yours of the 15th. As I told you, I'm going to do my best to get on, but heaven only knows what the chances are. Mr. Hotchkiss wrote telling me he wanted to come on Thursday, which is a perfectly impossible day for me at this stage of the session. So for all of its mundane splendor, the brief letter nonetheless suggests that by 1899, the two men were more than new acquaintances. You know, this isn't like a, initial letter to a complete stranger or somebody they don't really know well. Indeed, it's plausible, if not probable, that they had known each other for nearly 20 years by the time this particular letter was written. Looking at TR and Ansley's activities and interests, it seems most likely that their paths would have crossed sometime in the early 1880s, during the time that TR served in the New York State Assembly, 1882 to 1884. An early encounter might have involved the effort to eliminate industry from the immediate vicinity of Niagara Falls, restore its natural beauty, and provide public access to the spectacular cataract. In 1883, with Governor Grover Cleveland's support, the New York State Legislature authorized the acquisition of land around the falls in order to create a state park. Ansley had only been practicing law for a few years at the time, but served as an attorney for the Niagara River Commission, representing the state's interest in helping to make the vision a reality. Further, he belonged to the Buffalo chapter of the Niagara Falls Association, an organization dedicated to promoting public and legislative support for the Niagara Reservation, which counted Theodore Roosevelt among the members of its Albany chapter. So there was a connection there. Civil service reform was another cause that was near and dear to both men. While TR was a member of the New York Civil Service Reform Association as early as 1881, Ansley helped organize the National Civil Service Reform League and was a founder of the Buffalo Civil Service Reform Association. He would go on to serve as its president for 25 years. In the New York State Assembly, TR worked diligently to advance New York's Civil Service Act. Passed in 1883, it was the first state-level civil service act in the country. When the law's constitutionality was tested before the New York State Court of Appeals in the case of Rogers v. City of Buffalo, 1890, Ansley was part of the legal team that defended the law and ultimately established its constitutionality. Given that TR was such a strong advocate for the law, and the fact that he was serving as U.S. Civil Service Commissioner when the case was making its way through the courts, it's reasonable to assume that he would have followed its progress and been aware of Ansley's involvement. Regardless of how they met, the relationship between TR and Ansley is one that spanned decades. There are approximately 140 letters between them in the Library of Congress collection. The majority of the letters, about 60, are from either 1889 or 1900. I just kind of did a count and made a little graph there so I could visualize that myself. So 1899 or 1900 is where we see this big bump. And that was when TR was serving as the 36th governor of New York State. In 1899, TR appointed Ansley to the Board of Managers for the Elmira State Reformatory. According to TR, Ansley played a valuable role in investigating accusations of abusive conditions at the facility, and although Ansley resigned from the board at the end of the year, he was soon called back into service by the governor. Charges of corruption had been leveled against New York County District Attorney Asa Bird Gardner, and TR appointed Ansley as a special commissioner to investigate and take testimony in the matter. Hearings were held between February and June of 1900, and the men's letters frequently reference the details of the case. They're all online if anybody wants to dive into the details. I didn't really want to bore you to death because it gets really, really kind of dry. However, the letters also include more personal references. My personal favorite is a letter from TR dated January 25th, 1900. Responding to a letter which apparently included an invitation to visit the Wilcox home here at 641 Delaware Ave, TR writes, quote, "I think that there will be much heartburn if I go into any private houses, so I shall reluctantly have to adhere to my general rule and go to the hotel. Believe me how much Mrs. Roosevelt and I have appreciated your kind and cordial offer of hospitality." Of course, slightly more than a year and a half later, TR would accept an offer of hospitality from Ansley and make history in the Wilcox house. The trail of correspondence between the two men seems to wane a bit during TR's presidency, as we can see, but remains warm. TR issues a number of White House invitations. Oh, whoops, that he made history as, took the oath, that whole thing. Whoops. We're going to skip right back to here. TR issues a number of White House invitations to Ansley and Mary Grace, including this one from 1906. Ansley comments on some of the policy issues that TR is dealing with, and/or provides what might be seen as an on-the-ground feedback to the administration's work. As TR is about to leave the White House in March of 1909, Ansley writes to congratulate TR on his imminent return to, quote, "the ranks of private citizens," and expresses appreciation for his leadership, quote, "particularly in the great movement for the moral and social and industrial uplift of our conditions of life." The response Ansley received thanks TR for his letter and goes on to say, quote, the response Ansley received thanks him for his letter and goes on to say, "You have been very closely associated with my administration throughout, and I thank you for all that you have done." Again, there was a lull in communication between the two in the years immediately following TR's presidency. But like so many others, Ansley writes to TR in July of 1918 to express his deep sympathy when TR's youngest son, Quentin, is killed in World War I. What I find interesting, however, is that that letter seems to renew the association between Ansley and TR. And in what would be the last months of TR's life, there was a relative flurry of correspondence. Perhaps this shouldn't be surprising, though, since at the time there was a growing debate about how returning veterans, those returning from World War I, as well as veterans of the home front, should be integrated into the existing civil service system. TR is asking Ansley what he thinks, and they're going back and forth on the best ways to do that. In a letter written only 9 days before his untimely death, TR expresses regret about a, quote, misunderstanding that prevented him from seeing Ansley. He writes, quote, "You, my dear fellow, are one of the men whom I always wish to see." 9 days before he dies. Yeah, that was kind of weird. In conclusion, the relationship between Theodore Roosevelt and the man who hosted his 1901 inauguration was an enduring one that likely spanned the better part of 4 decades. And although Ansley Wilcox was not one of TR's closest confidants and advisors, he was nonetheless key to one of the most significant moments in TR's life. Thank you.